morning.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so this is a new paper that I'm working with Sean. So here we're looking at how uncertainty impacts innovation, R&D patterns, and also, what are the implications for economic growth in the long run. And we're gonna focus on geopolitical uncertainty for a couple of reasons. So first, I should say this is a study in the US. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we picked US. One is obviously a lot more data when it comes to patterns available in the US, and also a lot of data when it comes to geopolitical issues. So if you were to pick like Australia, there'll be a time series would be like nothing, one event. US, I'm going to show you there's quite a bit. So it's interesting. All right, so I'll start because I wasn't sure about the time I'm going to have. So I'll actually start with what we do in the paper, our contributions. So the first thing is we're going to create a measure of geopolitical uncertainty. Now we pick geopolitical uncertainty because this kind of uncertainty is very different to other types of uncertainties, and this is quite important. So let's say you're thinking about an uncertainty like let's say economic policy uncertainty, policy related uncertainty. To know the impact of uncertainty on, let's say, a firm's innovation decisions, you need to be able to identify uncertainty versus the regular market conditions. So if it's a recession, let's say in the US, firms might react to the recession, and during this recession, the uncertainty might be high, like the policy-related uncertainty. So we don't know if the uncertainty is causing these firms to change their, let's say, R&D behavior, or is it the actual the uncertainty? Now, these geopolitical uncertainties, they're largely unrelated to local economic conditions, right? So how, let's say, a terrorist organization reacts is largely unrelated to US conditions. So we're going to create this measure of geopolitical uncertainty just for this reason, just to kind of identify the effects of uncertainty. Then we're going to show that uncertainty actually reduce firm level investments in R&D and their patenting activity, and we will and it's quite robust. And the bigger question is, why is this the case? And we're gonna show this is because uncertainty is gonna interact with the innovative competition in an industry, and also it's going to have greater financial friction. So we're going to identify two ways through which uncertainty impacts corporate innovation. And finally, I'm not going to talk much about this in today's presentation because of the time, but we show that using industry level data, this uncertainty this actually has really bad long-term implications for the economy. So in terms of GDP growth. Okay, so how do we define geopolitical uncertainty? So this is a bit tricky. Now there's quite a bit of these indexes. There's firms that actually sell. You can buy these, the geopolitical risk or geopolitical uncertainty indexes. This is a bit of a problem because one, not everybody has access to these. So we don't know who has access. So you're going to have this selection bias. And two is that they're very broadly defined. So we're going to follow the definition by Caldera and Iaccoviello there's a very new paper. So they kind of define geopolitical risk as basically, it's quite specific. So this is risk associated with things like wars, terrorist attacks, anything that you cannot peacefully resolve, right? So we're going to keep the same definition. The thing about geopolitical risk is it doesn't have to. You don't have to have the actual act realized. Now, obviously, an event like, let's say, 9/11, this is an actualized event, right? So we all saw what happened. This is an act. But then cases where, you know, there was a lot of uncertainty related to, let's say, the ISIS attack. It's like they would threaten, we're gonna, you know, do this, we're gonna do that. Some of these events didn't actually materialize, but the uncertainty is there, right? So we want to capture that as well. And, you know, not that these are not important. So the events like, you know, let's say the Brexit or all these political events, they're very important. Those are highly uncertain times. But for this study, because we want to kind of disentangle the effects of the economy and the uncertainty itself, we're going to leave those out. Okay, so the measure we create is, okay, this part is just that, you know, sorry, before I get to the measure, so in the literature, you know, they show both. There's some papers that actually say uncertainty can actually spur innovation, like a patenting activity, because you know, it's uncertain, so few firms might try to take advantage of this situation. And then there's some literature that shows it actually decreases innovation. But this is kind of controversial because they use these policy-related uncertainty measures. We don't know, you know, the issue is, again, policy-related uncertainty is high, usually during recession. So we don't know what's causing what, right? So that's kind of why we get to why we create this geopolitical risk measure. Now, there's two measures we're going to use. One measure that we create, so I'll get to, sorry, the next slide. So the measure we create, we're going to call it, maybe for the lack of innovation on our part, just simply War and Terror Events Indicator. Okay, so WTE, it's very easy to, you know. So this is simply an indicator-based measure. How we create this measure is there's two databases. So one is this global terrorism database maintained, this is at the University of Maryland. So they basically record almost every single terrorist event that's happened in the last 50 years or so. So it's a very large database, very comprehensive. So we go through all this information to figure out, you know, what are the terrorist events that happen. When it comes to war-related events, we use this database, the International Crisis Behavior Database, and that's also quite comprehensive. But this is all about wars. So the first one is about terrorism, this is about wars. We take these events, we use a little bit of filtering on our own because there's a large amount of data there. We want to find events that actually, you know, that capture, you know, these large, you know, something that, let's say, the firm managers might feel is important. So there's a, you know, the manager has to feel this, something, you know, that's real. So, you know, something minor, these minor events might not matter. So we want to make sure, okay, you know, at least, let's say 10 people died from an event. Okay, so I know the 10 is a bit arbitrary, what happens if 9 dies, but, you know, it's not that sensitive, you know. We make sure the events happen in either North America or in Western Europe, because we actually find that events that happen, let's say, in areas like Africa, for example, has almost no effect. The managers don't really care about these kind of events. So we stick to events happening in, or at least either US is involved or these events happened in North America or Europe. And we make sure these are well-known terrorist groups, so at least from the perspective of an agent in the US. Okay, so when we do this, so here's the two measures. So the measure we create based on those two databases is these blue lines. Okay, so these blue lines tell us, you know, since 1970 to today, what are the times that we think, based on these data sources, you know, is likely a high uncertain time in the US, right? So events like Gulf War or during, you know, the September 11 attacks, and sometimes these, you know, like let's say Paris attacks by, you know, ISIS, and all those times are very high geopolitical uncertain times. The black line is a different measure. It's not our measure. It's by the two authors I mentioned at the Federal Reserve in the US. They basically count the number of newspaper articles that talks about these geopolitical events. Now, the two measures kind of correlate pretty nicely. I'm going to show you why we think our measure is better, but it doesn't really matter because even if you use their measure, we still get the same results. Okay, so given that we've talked a lot about innovation today, this is, I don't need to go too much into this. So we look at innovative inputs. One is just simply R&D intensity, how much R&D expenditure you use per your total asset size for a firm. We use two innovative outputs as our main measure. One is simply the patent citations, a lot of literature uses. And this is a relatively newer measure, the private value of patents. This is how much these patents are worth to the firm itself. So this is based on the stock return reaction to each patent. Then we use some of the other measures like number of patents, patent originality, generality. So we use a whole bunch of measures. So first I'm going to show you the aggregate results. So this is basically looking at, this is a local projection. So it's very similar to the VARs from the last paper, except this is slightly better because this is not so model dependent. So what we look at is, okay, if there's a shock to uncertainty, what really happens to innovation in the future? So it's very simple, controlling for a whole lot of stuff. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the technical stuff too much. So this is what happens. So if there is if you move into this regime where now there's high geopolitical uncertainty, what we see is when it comes to regular investment, like capital investments, there's a significant drop for about 3 quarters. So there's a temporary drop in capital investments. But when it comes to intellectual property, so the things with innovation, this drop is a lot longer. It takes a long time, and it happens closer to like 3 years, 4 years down the road. So we have to take a longer time frame when it comes to research and development and other intellectual property. One more thing I want to mention is when it comes to consumption and government spending, we don't see much change. So this kind of gives us a little bit of nice comfort that we're capturing uncertainty, because people don't respond that much to uncertainty in terms of their household consumption. But if it's a recession or something like that we're capturing, then we would see a bigger effect on consumption, and the government would spend more money in response to a recession. For example, let's say COVID-19, the government has to step in, right? This is why we think our measure is better than let's say, a news-based measure. When there's a shock to our measure, you can see the number of articles about geopolitical risk increasing, not just for 1 or 2 quarters, it's going to increase for a long time, because newspapers allow these kind of events, right? So they're going to keep talking about this over and over, so there's going to be persistence, whereas our measure is very clean and nice. It just captures, boom, here's the event, and that's it. So what happens at the firm level? We run a simple panel regression controlling for, yes. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, I'll show you the results. So WTE, again, is our measure. GPR is the news-based measure. What happens to firm level R&D, firm level patent citations, firm level private value of patents? They all significantly decrease. And no matter what kind of controls we use, there's a significant drop when you're looking at a 3-year time period, right? So this is on average. So just like what we saw with the aggregate results, firm level results show the same. So the interesting question to me is why this happens. So one is based on basically competition. So it's more about, more than product market competition, it is more about innovative competition. So the argument here is that if uncertainty increase, if you're in a competitive industry, your option value of weighting is much higher than if you're a firm that's in a very concentrated industry. This is because, if you just intuitively, if you're in a very competitive industry, you have to deal with a whole lot of rivals, right? So in an uncertain time, this, the benefits of getting into this innovative race is much lower. Whereas if you're in a highly concentrated industry, you don't have this fear of somebody else beating you in this innovative race. You might actually innovate in those industries just to keep potential entrants away, right? So the theoretical literature argues that the effects of uncertainty should be higher for these more competitive industries. Now, we use this measure of creative destruction to capture innovative competition. So creative destruction is simply how much in the same industry, how innovative are your competitors? How much patents are they producing? How much patent value they're producing? So if you're in a very competitive industry, this creative destruction would be much higher. We also use the standard Herfindahl indexes for product market competition just for robustness. So in the next slide, what we show is if it's a very high competitive industry, they have, compared to a less competitive industry, there's a significantly higher drop in innovation, right? So, and this is robust across, the two measures we use. And in the paper we show, for other measures of competition, we find the same effect. And then in the next slide, we talk about, next slide, it's a bit slow. Financial market frictions. Here the argument is that in uncertain times, the equity markets become highly volatile. So in theoretical models like Pasta and Varanasi, they show that the risk premium increases. So if the risk premium increases, that means the actual price of the asset is going to decrease, right? So if you want to issue equity in these uncertain times, you have to issue equity at a very low price, right? So you cannot easily raise equity to fund your innovation in a high uncertain times. So if you're a firm that's highly dependent on, let's say, equity issuance, this uncertainty should impact you more than a firm that doesn't depend so much on this external equity issuance. Similarly, if you're a firm that's highly dependent on internal cash flows, this is going to impact you more because uncertainty is going to impact the internal cash constraints. So we test both of them. If you look at the next slide, I'm only going to show you the cash one. The equity issuance is exactly the same. We find again the firms that's more constrained, internal cash flow constraints, the effect is greater for them. And we find the same for external equity issuance. So, and I just want to, again, I wasn't too sure about the time. So, all right, awesome. And that's basically it. So this is still at an early stage. So any comments would be appreciated.
Thank you. Comments, questions? Quite a diverse range. We talked a little bit about different technologies before. I remember a very early discussion.
Yeah.
That you looked at defense technologies and so on. So did you see anything on?
So for defense, we don't find this negative effect actually. And then the other so we
but it's not positive either.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just insignificant. It just stays constant. Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean, so defense firms might not patent the same way either.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're getting a government contract to build some,
sometimes they have secrecy norms.
Yeah, they don't.
Yeah.
Not disclosed. Systems.
So it's a bit, it's a bit hard to track this.
But you could even, did you look for different industries and whether there is difference in effect?
We only look the industries like at the competition level type of thing, but not just the industry type. So I mean by the what they produce like that's something we should do probably.
I'm pretty sure for utility firms, we did this. I think we did the other papers. I think pretty much for utility firms. I think maybe we find a positive effect or something. I mean, at least for capex investments. Yeah, because utility firms they're not really
for capital investments. Yeah,
it may it could be even that you need to invest in security, in particular when you look at terrorism, right? So you would expect, I think the story you would expect with terrorism that certain types of investments get triggered, right? That's what I wouldn't.
There's a big debate at the moment about emergency powers in intellectual property during times of crisis. So, you know, historically, the United States government overrode some of the patents of the White brothers during a scare over anthrax. You know, the US government threatened companies with compulsory licensing, particularly in the context of public health epidemics. There's been lots of discussions about flexibilities in times of crisis.
Right.
So I think it'd be worthwhile having a think about that, in addition to your question about, well, what happens in terms of registration and application rates. There's also a very hot question at the moment about do governments have exceptional powers to provide access to key inventions to deal with a public health crisis or a national emergency or time of war. But defence has some very strange norms. I've just got a new book on patents for power about defence patents, and there's lots of peculiar and strange dynamics within that particular sector.
Yeah.
Some of them are related to secrecy. Some of them are related to some other issues as well. So I do think there's some interesting issues in that space about IP in a time of crisis.
Right.
Or
And
in
is
an
that
emergency.
kind of data available to look at, or is
Well, it's a bit patchy in terms of, you know, circumstances in which the emergency powers have been invoked.
right?
Sometimes it's just a threat and that is enough. Sometimes you have an actual kind of compulsory license being granted or a government use being enabled. But it is a kind of a key issue.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it goes to questions around property, like in times of war.
Yeah.
Can one company hold on to a monopoly on, say, planes, for instance? Or do you enable other manufacturers to kind of provide access? So it's quite a, that side of it is kind of quite interesting in terms of, you know, sometimes certain inventions become really important and significant depending upon the nature of the crisis.
Right.
So would most of this would be reported in the media, right? At least for the US government, would you?
Yeah. Well, it could be related to local manufacturing, or it could be an export. So you could have either scenario. But I mean, as the COVID crisis shows, you know, a certain set of equipment, like say personal protective equipment, became much more important very quickly.
So
Yeah,
what
that's
is
it, that's-
it's told that in some areas there'd be like an increase in innovation depending on what the crisis is and what the response is as well, to sort of counteract and be prepared for that. So, and you know, traditionally you've seen like sort of big leaps in like, you know, after the, you know, the Great Wars and things, and you know, if the threat's sort of germ warfare versus, you know, as the threats change, there's often that response to be able to, you know, probably there's huge amounts of IP around masks and stuff at the moment. So that's why I'd be thinking that in some areas there would be huge innovation shifts.
Well, sometimes crisis generates
Well, that's what they say. It's
big new
innovation.
science projects. You think
Yeah.
about something like the Manhattan Project, for instance, which was a crisis-driven.
Yeah, and you
Big
know,
science
have we become,
innovation
you know, be able
project.
to survive ourselves without,
Yeah.
you know, needing everything
Right.
else goes down.
I think that'll be interesting to look at for sure. Yeah.